Hello, I'm Captain Dr. Dave. I want to welcome you to this part 3 of my Cruising with Pets video presentation. And it is brought to you courtesy of my website, CaptainDrDave.com, CaptnDrDave, as you see down in your lower right hand corner of your screen. This video series is designed or aimed at people who are living aboard a boat or planning on cruising long term with pets on board. And generally, you are not going to run into any significant issues if you have a pet on board. But the whole gist of this series is to hopefully help you avoid issues that might lead to some health problems. And because you very often are caught in a situation or a circumstance where a veterinarian is not easy to find, you may be in the Caribbean, you may be cruising the coast of Mexico or South America. You may be overseas someplace in the South Pacific or in the Mediterranean and be in a situation where veterinarian is a long distance away and trying to make a decision as to whether to up anchor and head off on a 2 or 3 day cruise to get to help is sometimes a difficult issue. If we can avoid those kinds of issues, generally it makes life a whole lot easier. So what I am going to do is we're going to start out right here talking about some common health problems. And these are problems that you may encounter wherever you happen to be. And if you happen to be living aboard a boat, these particular, what I call common household health problems, become a lot more of an issue sometimes when you're in a situation where veterinary care is not easily available. So we're going to just talk about some things, and we're going to start out with eye problems. And one of the biggest things with eye problems is that we have a potential here when there's an eye problem. You, as the pet owner, really do not have any way of knowing whether what appears to be a simple eye problem really is something that may be much more significant than you might think. Sometimes a problem looks like it's a major problem, and it isn't. But with an eye problem, my attitude is we always want to treat it as if it's a major problem because it has the potential to become one, even if it isn't right now. One of the simple things that you can do is carry a bottle of eye irrigating solution in your medical kit, whether it's in your pet's kit or whether it's in your own medical kit. A bottle of eye irrigating solution is an excellent thing to have on board. It is generally the one thing that you can do when there's an eye issue, whether you have a crusty eye or some drainage from an eye, or you've got an eye that's all of a sudden looking squinty and kind of red. One thing that you can do that is almost always safe and not going to cause any complications is to flush that eye out with a bottle of eye irrigating solution. You kind of tip the animal's head up a little bit and take the bottle and hold it in the palm of your hand with the tip of it pointed at the eye, and hold the eye open with the finger and thumb of the other hand and just kind of squeeze gently to get a nice little stream of irrigating solution into that eye. It is generally not going to cause any problem, and it may, if there's something in there that's an irritant of some sort, you may flush it out and may save yourself a lot of headaches. I generally tell people to do it twice a day for a day or two. If after you've done it, once or twice, if by the next day, the day after you've done it, it's still not looking like it's getting any better, you probably should head off to and seek some professional help. Do not use products like Visine. Do not use anything that's designed to, quote, get the red out. Getting the red out is simply a matter of covering up symptoms, and those very symptoms are what let you know that there is a problem. Covering them up just allows the problem to get worse without your realizing it. So never use anything that's designed to cover up symptoms. What we want to do is get to the root of the problem and cure the problem so that you can relax and not have to worry. Another product you can carry is a triple antibiotic ophthalmic ointment. This is similar to Neosporin, but it is not the same thing as what you use on your skin. This is an ophthalmic product, which means it's designed to go in the eye. Triple antibiotic ophthalmic ointment is not a bad idea to have in your kit, uh, but generally it's not going to cure anything it's not going to it's not really going to get you any significant improvement over your eye irrigating solution, so it's not something that I consider to be urgent that you carry it with you. It is generally something that generally should be used under the guidance of a veterinarian. And if you choose to use a triple antibiotic ointment in the eye, you should not use anything that contains a steroid. Steroids are an anti-inflammatory, and they can cover up, they can take that red out of the eye. They can cover up those symptoms, just like we were talking, and and they can actually aggravate the problem and make it worse. You can recognize steroids by looking at the ingredients label, and if you see anything on there that ends with the letters ONE, such as dexamethasone, prednisone, prednisolone, betamethasone, triamcinolone. Those are your common corticosteroids that very often appear in antibiotic ointments. You should not use it in an eye if you see any of those as an ingredient. Remember that an eye can deteriorate in a hurry, so you should seek professional help as soon as possible. This is a bottle of eye irrigating solution. That's what it looks like. And you unscrew the top, point the pointy end of the tip at the eye, and again hold the eyelids open and gently squeeze a steady stream of eye irrigating solution into the eye to try and flush it out. You can do that 2 or 3 times a day. See if you get any improvement. Another issue that you're likely to run into is ear problems. They're quite common. They tend to be ubiquitous, and some dogs have chronic ear problems that are difficult to deal with. If you have one of those dogs, you're probably well aware of this situation. And another thing you should be aware of if you have one of those dogs is that it's probably going to get worse, or at very best, it's not going to get any better when you're off cruising, when the dog is off swimming and getting those ears wet. So you need to be prepared for that. You need to talk to your veterinarian about it. If you have no ear problems, you should learn to know right now what those ears look and smell like. So take a look, start looking at those ears a couple of times a week. Get your nose down there, smell them, because smell is probably one of the key indicators when we have an ear problem. If one ear smells foul, or if both of those ears smell foul, then we've got a problem. And one of the key things to keep in mind is most of the time when you get an ear problem in a dog, you suddenly get an acute ear infection. One ear will smell different from the other. Okay, and when one ear smells different from the other, it's a pretty good indicator that something is wrong. So a bad ear is generally, a bad smelling ear is generally an infected ear or a bad ear. You should get in the habit of using swimmer's ear drying solution each time after swimming. We'll talk about that shortly. So, talk to your veterinarian if you have a dog who has ear problems, and if there's something that seems to help control those ear problems, you should bring it along with you on your cruise. Now, I generally tell people that you should, when you have a dog and you take it cruising, or in the case of a cat who likes to swim, but a lot of dogs like to do a lot of swimming, you should get into the routine of taking care of the dog every time it's been in the water swimming. And this may be a pain in the butt for some people if you've got one of those dogs that wants to jump in the water every 15 minutes. You still need to address this issue. And if you have a large dog with a thick coat, such as a retriever of some sort, you may want to have a water maker on your boat just so that you have adequate water to do all of this. So you should get in the habit of doing this every time when he's done swimming to avoid problems. Excuse me. You should rinse the coat profusely with copious amounts of fresh water. This is not a shampoo. You don't need any soap. Soap is hard on the coat. Soap is hard on the skin. Shampoo is hard on the skin. All we want to do is replace dirty water or salty water with fresh water. And that's pretty simply done just by taking a hose and rinsing the dog off thoroughly so you get rid of all the salt water or any of the dirty water that's in the coat. I used to quite frequently have people come in when I practiced in the Chesapeake Bay region, and also in the Great Lakes even. People who would come in and have a dog that had a nasty dermatitis going on, and they couldn't figure out how the dog got it. And after inquiring of the dog's whereabouts, say over the past several days, I would often find out that the dog had been to the beach 3 or 4 days or a week earlier and had been doing a lot of swimming. And the owner didn't think anything of it at the time because the dog would go swimming, and then when he got out of the water, he'd lie down in the shade or lie down in the sun, and basically the sun would incubate the bacteria that's in that water would be incubating against the skin and setting up a nasty dermatitis. And that was generally the source of the dermatitis, and it can turn into quite a chronic problem. It can become quite an issue. So I generally recommend to people that you, whether you're living on a boat or not, that you get in this swimming routine when your dog does some swimming. So rinse the coat profusely with a large amount of fresh water, and then rinse the ears in the same way. Rinse the ears with fresh water and massage them. You can often do this by holding a hose with gently running hose about 6 inches or so above the ears, and let the water trickle into the ears and just kind of massage it in. What we want to do is replace dirty water with clean water, replace salt water with fresh water. I always have an order of things. We'd rather have clean water than dirty water. We'd rather have fresh water than salt water. And but ideally we'd like to have no water at all. But in order to do that, you have to keep your dog out of the water. So we need to make our preference known here. We want fresh, clean water replacing any dirty or salty water. So rinse those ears with fresh water and massage. Then towel dry the ears as completely as possible. You can use a towel, a paper towel. You can put a cotton ball down in the ear and massage it. Get as much of that water out of there as you can. And then you should put 1 or 2 drops of ear drying solution into each ear and massage and wipe again so that it is dry. And the idea of the ear drying solution is that the ear drying solution is mostly alcohol, and it's very mostly pure alcohol. So what it does is alcohol combines very readily with water, and then the alcohol evaporates. We all know the cooling effect of when you put alcohol on your skin. And that is essentially what happens. It evaporates and takes the water with it. And when we use ear drying solution, it contains a little bit of glycerin, which leaves behind a coating of glycerin to keep the ears moist after we've dried them out. This is a commercial bottle of ear drying solution. When I'm talking about ear drying solution, I'm talking about human ear drying solution. What we put in our own ears, in my opinion, is generally better than what we put in than the products that are on the market for dog ears. I see too many dogs that suffer from the drying effects of some of the products that are on the market for drying out dog ears. You don't want to overdo this issue. Okay, you want to do it as much as it needs to be done and no more. And if you want to make your own, it's very simple to make. You go to the drugstore and you buy a bottle of isopropyl alcohol 90%, and very often it'll be labeled 91 or 93. I've seen it, usually it's an odd number, 91, 93, 95, 97% isopropyl alcohol. This is not rubbing alcohol. It's not the same thing. The 90% means that there's lots of room for it to suck up a bunch of water, which is what you want it to do. And then to that 90% plus alcohol, you add in a bottle this size, which is a 1 ounce bottle, add 2 or 3 drops or more if you like it to be slipperier. The more glycerin you add, the thicker it gets, and the harder it is to get it out of the bottle. But and then shake it up really well. Do not use this for sore or infected ears. It will sting. It is not a treatment for ear problems. It is a preventative for moisture issues in the ears. Now, gastrointestinal problems are always a potential problem. They can happen at home. They can happen just as easily aboard your boat. I always offer up the scenario of having a little get-together in the cockpit of your boat. Have some friends over, and little old Max is sitting under the table, and we all know that Max likes to have a treat now and then when he can get one. You've already warned all of your guests, do not give him any of the cheese and crackers, do not give him any of the the hickory stick or the salami or whatever the case, deviled eggs, because Max has a sensitive stomach and you don't want him to get sick. But nobody can resist that look on his face, and he's sitting there under the table, so they're slipping him stuff. And at some point later on, usually after everybody's gone home, Max suddenly needs to make a trip ashore, and you notice that he has a diarrhea problem. Or worse yet, you wake up in the middle of the night and you smell something, and he's left you a surprise. He can't help it. It's, these things happen. So what you need to do is know how to deal with it. It's going to be the same sort of thing as if this happened when he was at home. The treatment is to withhold food. I've got on here for at least 24 hours. Usually 12 hours in a mild case is good, but the key here is don't give him something to eat. If he's, particularly if he's been vomiting, but even with diarrhea, withhold food. Let the system settle down. Don't feed the fire. So withhold food for a good 12 hours or more, and then start him in on something gentle to eat after that. If there's vomiting, you should limit the water to small amounts frequently, just enough. In a case of a small dog, a teaspoon or two every hour or so. In the case of a big dog, half a cupful, just enough to moisten the mouth. What happens with the case of gastritis, and if there's vomiting going on, very often it's gastritis related, there's a tendency for them to want to scarf down a whole bunch of water, and that water leads to further irritation of the stomach. So after drinking a whole bunch of water, only moments later, they vomit up not only all of the water they just drank, but also lose some of their gastric contents. And you eventually end up with an electrolyte imbalance if this goes on for very long. And if it goes on for very long at all, you could end up with some dehydration also. So don't worry about the fact that he may miss a meal or two. Usually, in most cases, most dogs are overweight anyway. It's not going to hurt to miss a meal or two. Remember that most oral medications, if you give anything by mouth for vomiting, it's not going to work very well because the dog is vomiting. Okay. There isn't anything that's going to work given orally. If the vomiting coincidentally stops from giving oral medications, it's generally because the vomiting wasn't all that severe anyway. So don't give any oral medication. Just don't give anything orally. Let things rest. Okay, and vomiting that is not very severe is generally going to be self-limiting. So you don't have to give anything. If the vomiting goes on repeatedly, 15, 20 times, that sort of thing, goes on overnight and into the next day, then you probably got an issue that needs to be dealt with professionally. So don't be trying to treat vomiting with oral medications. Now, after you've fasted, okay, after you've gone that 12 to 24 hour fast, you need to start in slowly on a bland diet. And the bland diet that's generally recommended by myself and often by others is boiled hamburger, boiled and drained. You want no grease. Don't fry up some hamburgers and chop it up. That's not what we want. We want dull, gray, tasteless boiled hamburger, or you can use boiled skinless, boneless chicken chopped up. Either one, very small amount. Okay, usually I tell people about 1/4 the amount of meat to the amount of boiled white rice. There's not any benefit to giving brown rice or long grain and wild rice, all those kinds of things. White rice is much more bland, much easier to digest, and we're not into a health food kick here. We're into a prescription treatment for a health issue. All right. So boiled white rice with a small amount of boiled and drained hamburger, and you basically feed a small amount. In a small dog, you probably give them a teaspoon of this to start them out, and wait an hour, see if it stays down. This is after you've fasted for 12 24 hours and you haven't seen any vomiting going on. Then you can start in on this. In a big dog, you might give them a half a cupful, say in a Labrador Retriever, and wait a half an hour to an hour and see how things go, and then do it again, repeat. And when you get about halfway through this amount of hamburger and rice diet that you've mixed up, when you get about halfway through, you can start to mix in a little bit of his regular diet. But take a good 24 hours from the time he starts back in on food to the point where you've got him switched back over to his regular food. Don't try to catch up. Don't be in a hurry. I always tell people that. Everybody's afraid that Max is going to starve to death because he's missed a couple of meals. The whole idea here is let the system rest so that you don't get into a critical situation, and make your changeover gradual. There are injectable drugs that you can give for vomiting, and you can give fluids. In the case of a serious vomiting issue, learning to give injections is not a bad idea. If you have my book, Where There Is No Pet Doctor, and if you have the DVD, Veterinary Care for Your Dog, it shows you how to do injections. It shows you how to do subcutaneous fluids under the skin, which sometimes can be life-saving, but most of the time you don't need all of that. You don't need to be that aggressive. Most people want to get more aggressive than they really need to get. So some injectable medications to consider having aboard, and these may be difficult to get. A lot of veterinarians are not going to be willing to send these with people. They don't know the circumstances you are going into. They have to be concerned with liability issues. There's a lot to think about, and don't be upset if your veterinarian doesn't readily send this stuff with you. But just like a human who's going off on a cruise, you go to the human doctors and you tell them you want the prescriptions for various medications. You have to find the right doctor who's really willing to stick his neck out in order to do this stuff. So remember, if you have the injectable medications aboard, even if you don't know how to do these procedures, if you don't know how to give injections or fluids, there might be somebody else in the anchorage when you're having a problem. There might be somebody else there who can do it for you. You get on the VHF radio and you call and you inquire and find out if anybody will do it for you. Balanced electrolyte solutions such as lactated ringers or Normasol R or Plasma-Lyte. How much you need depends on the size of the pets. You need at least one IV drip set for each bag and several needles. Cerenia is a anti-vomiting drug that is almost a miracle drug since it's come out. It came out a few years ago, and it has allowed us to treat vomiting very often with a single injection that's good for 24 hours, and by the time it wears off, the gastritis has resolved. If you carry just 1 or 2 doses per pet, appropriately labeled in your medical kit, you probably never need it and you'll end up throwing it away, and it is not a cheap medication. So it's up to you what you want to do in regard to this stuff. You rehydrate your pet with fluids given under the skin and give a subcutaneous injection of Cerenia to control the vomiting, and very often one treatment is adequate, in moderate cases. Once vomiting is controlled, you can give oral medication, but usually once it's under control, you really don't need that. But for the diarrhea, metronidazole, which is Flagyl, a lot of people are familiar with Flagyl. It's quite commonly used in people for dysentery situations and for diarrhea. It is a very good intestinal antibiotic, and it provides some symptomatic relief of diarrhea while you're withholding the food and water and doing all this. You can do all that, and if you're interested in doing this stuff, you can carry aboard the book and videos that demonstrate the techniques for these things. And here is a suggested veterinary kit that's a little more complete than what we talked about in part 1 of these videos. It still includes the heartworm preventative, whatever your choice is, and the ones that I have a V next to are veterinary only products. A lot of you'll see that most of the products on this list can be human products, like the amoxicillin or the ciprofloxacin, aspirin, all right, and eye irrigating solution, ophthalmic antibiotic ointment, swimmer's ear drying solution. We've got a lot of things on here that we had in part 1 that I showed you on the list. I've got on here activated charcoal gel. That can be a lifesaver in the case of a poisoning situation. However, not everybody wants to be that involved. Panicure is a dewormer that's commonly used in veterinary medicine. And I've got down here a skin stapler and gauze squares, stretch gauze. There's a lot of things on here. Vet wrap, self-sticking bandage. You know, there's a lot of things that you can carry. You can carry a full duffel bag full of medical supplies, but sometimes we get to the point of being silly. And we don't, you know, you remember most of this stuff's going to end up expiring and you're going to throw it away. So do not get too carried away with what you're doing. But these are just some ideas. This is a picture of Wardwick Wells in the Exuma Islands in the Bahamas. This is a national park in the Bahamas. It's a very, very pleasant place, very beautiful, picturesque location. Wounds. All right, now wounds are not likely to be an issue, but these are one of those things that are likely to make you panic more than just about anything else that you're likely to run into. Most people panic even in the presence of a relatively minor wound. So it's, you know, what you need to do here is keep a level head, all right, and take a look and evaluate what you've got. You know, how much bleeding is going on, how deep is the wound, and just because you can see what looks like something white down in it doesn't mean you're looking at bone. Very often it's tendon, or it may be some connective tissue that's under the skin, but usually if you can see something white in a wound and the skin parts readily, that usually means you've cut all the way through the skin. The key with wounds is to keep them clean. We all should know that. We should all be aware of that. Basically, you want to keep the wound clean and leave it open to heal. That's my advice. If you can't get to somebody, you know, if there's a veterinarian around, even if you got to take an all day getting to it, if you're in Puerto Rico and you got to rent a car and drive into San Juan or whatever, you know, whatever the situation. If you've got a wound, it's best to get to a veterinarian and get that wound closed if it need, you know, and if it's a gaping type of wound. But keep in mind that if you can't get to somebody, any wound, if you can keep it clean, is going to eventually heal itself. The body has tremendous healing powers, and all we've got to do is not get in its way. Don't slop on a bunch of ointment, and don't put a bunch of crap on it that is going to make it all gooey and attract dirt and dust and all that sort of thing. You do need to watch out for flies and maggots and all that sort of thing. So if you're in a hot area where flies are an issue, then a light dressing over the top of the wound so that flies can't readily get to it, or keep the dog down below and keep the area screened in. Um, if it's a wound on the body, a t-shirt very often works well. Small dog can wear an infant t-shirt. Big dog can wear your own t-shirt to fit the size, but it'll basically cover the torso of the body to protect whatever might be there. This is where you use your betadine antiseptic that we talked about in part one as a flush or a soak. If the wound's on the foot, you can soak it. If the wound's anywhere else on the body, you can mix up your betadine solution, betadine mixed with clean fresh water to look like strong tea. Put it in a squirt bottle and use it to flush the wound. You can flush it a couple times a day for the first 2 or 3 days just to keep it clean, then kind of blot it dry, and then put something over it so that it's not exposed to the flies and the dirt and all that sort of thing. But basically, keeping it clean will allow it to heal. And remember, ointments and other goopy stuff just tends to attract dirt. And Neosporin, Panalog, if you feel the need, those are okay, but avoid a lot of most things, you know, just try to refrain from putting anything on there. If you want to use your amoxicillin, this is a good situation for your amoxicillin just to kind of cover for any possible infection. And that way it might help you relax a little bit and not put a bunch of goop on the thing. If you want to carry a skin stapler with you, you can. It's helpful in closing a simple laceration. Nice thing about a skin stapler is you can pop staples in very often with the pet just being manually restrained. In other words, somebody give them a hug. But it's hard to put staples in a lot of places on the body. You can't put them on the face very readily. You can't put them on the legs very readily because the bone's too close to the surface. But say on the chest or on the abdomen or someplace up on the back or on the thigh, very often a couple of skin staples will help something after you've flushed it out and cleaned it adequately. But again, if in doubt about contamination whatever the case, leave it open. All right. You don't want to close a wound with infection in it, and you can't see infection when it's there. If the wound's been there, and if you're any question about how long the wound has been there, do not close it. Remember, your whole objective here is to help the body do what the body is able to do naturally. Now, in the case of a very big wound, a very open wound, and you're nowhere near, again, this is one of those situations where get to a veterinarian. The veterinarian has the means and the skills to deal with this sort of thing. But if you're in a situation where there's absolutely no way you can get there, what we call sugar wraps. This is an old-fashioned means of treating wounds, and it generally is, we reserve it for those wounds that are just in a situation where it's not practical to try and close the wound. There's just too much exposure of too much skin missing, or too much of a wound to be able to close it with sutures. It is not designed for an open body cavity. It's not designed for an animal that has been impaled on something and has, an open chest wound or an open abdominal wound. But it is designed for skin, major size skin defects. The sort of situation where you look at it and say, well, it's going to need to have some grafting done. What you need is a bag of sugar, plain white sugar. And if it could be bleached or unbleached, but what you want is just plain sugar, not powdered sugar, but granulated sugar. And what you do is use the healing ability of the sugar. Now, you can use honey in this sort of situation too. Honey can be used. It works just as well. It's a little messier to work with, in my opinion. But if you're going to use honey, it cannot be pasteurized honey off the grocery store shelf. It has to be unpasteurized, natural honey. All right, the kind they sell on the side of the road that you stop at a place and somebody has bees and they're selling honey. That's the kind of honey you need. But whatever the case may be, you clean the wound as readily as you can, and you can see in this picture, this is a mammary case of mastitis in a dog. And what happened is this wound broke open. Basically, it turned into a large abscess and it broke open, and we got this big hole and a bunch of dead tissue and all kinds of stuff going on in this thing. And what you do in this sort of situation is clean it up as best you can, clip the hair all around as best you can, get everything out of the way, and cover it with sugar. All right, after you've cleaned it, you clean it, flush it, and then blot it dry, and then cover it with sugar, and then put a piece of gauze over the sugar, or whatever you have. If you have, take some clean t-shirts and tear them into strips and squares, and you can, whatever, if you're going to throw them away when you're done, put some sugar on there, and you fill it with sugar to the point where you can't see the wound anymore. A large volume. You essentially can't put too much. Then cover it, and then put a wrap over it to hold the sugar in place. And then and the hardest thing about it, if it's on the abdomen like it is on this dog, one of the hardest things about it is getting a wrap that will adequately hold it in place, because there's a tendency for it to move and want to, fold up and roll up and all that sort of thing. But the sugar will break down any bacteria. It tends to suck the moisture out of bacteria, and it tends to kill the bacteria. It tends to do the same thing to dead tissue, and it kind of sucks the moisture out of it and causes it to kind of flake off, and essentially cleans the wound over a period of a couple of days. So what you do is twice a day you take this wrap off, flush it out again with some fresh water, clean fresh water, dry it, blot it dry, replace the sugar, put a bunch of fresh sugar in. You may go through a couple of pounds of sugar in a period of 2 or 3 days doing this. You may go through 5-pound bag of sugar. And put a wrap on there again, keep the sugar in contact with that, and over a period of, usually takes 2 or 3 days before everything starts to clean up nicely. And with a very large open wound, it can go on for a week or more of doing this. But eventually what will happen is it will fill in with what we call granulation tissue, which is a very healthy pink uh, type of scar tissue. And we will get to the point where it will look like this. This is that same wound 6 days after starting. I thank Dr. Carol Matthews for these photographs. She's from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Guelph, Ontario, the veterinary school there. And you can see that there's still 2 little spots in the center of this wound that are not quite filled in with granulation tissue, but that rough looking pink tissue that you see is what we call granulation tissue, and it essentially is the body's way of healing this type of wound. And when it gets to this point, you can stop doing the sugar. You can probably take a little bit of Panalog or a little bit of Neosporin and put it on there a couple of times a day, and the body will eventually close this and heal it. But it may take another couple of weeks before skin to kind of close over it, and you'll get pink scar tissue over the top of it. But you need to remember that there's 3 layers on doing one of these. You put your sugar down and then put a first layer of something absorbent over that, either gauze squares, or you can put a little piece of towel, or you can put a piece of t-shirt. The second layer is put over the first layer to hold it in place, okay? Again, towels, t-shirts, whatever you want to use. You could even use plastic wrap. I'm not a big fan of that. And then the third layer, you can use something like an ace bandage or some type of bandaging material to hold it all in place. Or, again, you can make your own bandages. But basically, you need a layer holding the sugar in place, and then a layer over the top wrapped around the thing holding all of that in place, and then another layer over the top of it all to keep everything where you have it. And I usually suggest when you're doing this, they should be on antibiotic for at least the first week or so, if they should be on some oral antibiotic. And again, change the wrap twice a day for the first 2 or 3 days usually, and after that you can go to once a day. When you take the wrap off, the first few days when you take that wrap off, the sugar's going to all be gone, because what happens is it liquefies. In the process of doing what it does to the tissue, it liquefies and it essentially goes away. It'll leave a sticky residue behind, but the sugar itself will be gone, or the honey. And then, so you need to rinse it off, blot it dry, and put a new layer. And that's pretty much how it goes. And this is for you if you get caught, only if you get caught in a situation where you don't have much choice. And again, I reiterate, this is not for a penetrating wound. This is not for a stab wound into the chest or a big hole in the abdomen. This is for sizable skin wounds, skin defects. And after, when it gets to the point where the granulation tissue has filled in, you can quit the sugar. Now we're going to talk a little bit about feeding. All right, it is not likely something a lot of people take off and don't think about this before they leave. But it's not likely you're going to be able to get the same food, the same pet food everywhere you go. The more exotic the pet food, the more specialized the pet food, the less likely it is you're going to be able to get it. If you're feeding Purina dog chow, you're probably going to find that in an awful lot of places, or pedigree. If you're feeding Blue Buffalo seafood mix, or something along that line, you may have to search high and low to find it. If you're feeding some of the prescription diets, you may have a hard time finding them. So you need to keep in mind that you may end up having to change foods periodically, and you need to be prepared for that. So what I generally tell people to start doing before you take off with your pet is to get the pet accustomed to a variety of foods. And if you have a pet that doesn't do well on anything but a single particular food, and it's one that you have to drive across town to get, that pet may not be a good candidate for going cruising long term. So keep that in mind. What I tell people to do is buy, for your cat, buy a box of Meow Mix and a box of 9 Lives and a box of Blue Buffalo if you want. Mix them all together and feed them. And every time you start to get low, add 2 or 3 different ones to it, so that you're becoming accustomed to eating a variety of different foods, so that changes in the food will, the palate is not going to be affected by sudden changes in the food. Same thing with your dog. Okay, get a bag of Purina dog chow, get a bag of Alpo, get a bag of Iams, mix them all together, and when the food gets low, mix another bag of something new into it, and keep rotating through it so that your dog is not hooked on one particular food, and so that the change in the food becomes a routine thing for the dog, so that his system is not upset by the change. And I think that's probably one of the best pieces of advice that I can give you regarding feeding, is to not go off with the idea that you're going to feed um, the Iams in the orange bag to your cat, and that's all he's going to eat, because you may very well run into a situation where suddenly you can't get it. So what I suggest to people is that you mix foods together in order to reduce the change shock that goes on when there's a sudden change in food. And if they're always eating a minimum of 2 different diets, then when your food supply gets low, starts to get low, you can mix in something else with those diets and still have the enough of the old to mix together with the new to avoid the sudden shock from changing over. And you should start doing this now so that your pet can adjust and adapt to the food uh, now. And that way you won't have a sudden traumatic situation arise when you can't get the food that you're accustomed to getting. What you can do while you're out there is, when you do find your preferred diet, you can stock up. But it's sad if you're going to have to do your cruising and plan your cruising based on where you can get your pet some pet food. So it will do much better if you can get your pet accustomed to living the kind of life that you're going to live. Start now rather than waiting until after you've left. Remember that prescription diets may be difficult to find. You can get alternative suggestions from your vet. I have, a book here that I suggest to people if you're into preparing your own food. It's called Home Prepared Dog and Cat Diets, The Healthful Alternative. Donald Strombeck is a California veterinarian who did the first version of this book, the first edition. It is now in its second edition, and Patricia Schenck is now the author of this book, and it's changed substantially. I prefer the Donald Strombeck book, and you can still find that used at Amazon or Alibris online or wherever. But the Patricia Schenck book will work too, and it allows you to make your own diets, whether you need prescription foods or whether you need just normal diets. There are a whole variety of recipes in these books that are available for making your own diets, that might allow you to cruise for a long time using products that you can buy in human stores and avoid the pet food feeding entirely. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind is, if you carry dry food on board, dry pet food, you may end up with weevils in your food. All right, sometimes you look down in the bag and you'll see, you take out a scoop of food from the bag, and you'll find little bugs that are crawling around. Now, they're not good, they're not appetizing, they're not dangerous. Back in the days of the sailing ships, sailors used to take their biscuits out and knock them on the table before they ate them to get the weevils out of the biscuits. And then they would just go ahead and eat them. I always suggest to people that the weevils are essentially they've been taking old stale protein, and the weevils are converting it into nice, fresh, brand new protein. But still, it's pretty unappetizing to think about your pet eating the bugs, but it's not going to kill them if they do. All right. So what I suggest is that you can kind of let the weevils crawl out of the food until you can get fresh food, and then throw the food away. All right. Then throw away the infested food. But the one thing that I do tell people to throw away the food immediately is if you notice mold. All right, whether you smell it, whether you see it, if food looks cobwebby, if you can smell it, if it's gotten wet and you can smell mold, get rid of the food immediately, because there are all kinds of toxins that can be produced by mold. Some of them are deadly. Some of them can cause liver damage that you won't know about until 6 months or a year down the road or longer. Some of them can cause incessant vomiting, then what they call vomitoxin, um, and some of them can cause they they can be deadly. So get rid of moldy food immediately. As soon as you notice that it's moldy, get rid of it. And if you have to make something from your own food supplies to feed to the dog until you can get some more dog food, then do it that way. But don't feed that moldy dog food. Remember, bugs are not necessarily deadly, but mold is. And this is a picture of the first page there on the left hand side is out of my book, Where There Is No Pet Doctor. I have 2 or 3 diet recipes in the back of the book in the appendix area. That I offer, but it's by no means is it a complete diet book, but there's some suggestions there. The books I show here are the Home Prepared Dog and Cat Diets by Donald Strombeck, and then the new version of that by Patricia Schenk. These are, for those of you who are interested, not a bad way to go. Now I talk a little bit about pet safety. If you haven't started working on this, this is something you need to work with before you leave so that your pets are at least exposed to it. You should do pet overboard drills. All right. Now, if you've got a 18-year-old cat that weighs, 18 pounds, don't go out and throw it in the water and expect that this is giving it some benefit. You need to be realistic and rational about this. We don't want you to kill your pet doing this, but you need to start working with pet overboard drills if the pet's going to spend any amount of time on deck. Pets need to be able to find the boarding point on your boat no matter where they are in the water. So, what I always start off with is somewhere around the swim platform or around the stern of the boat. Put the pet in the water and fetch him back out. If this is a big dog, if this is a 100-pound Labrador Retriever, then you need to be prepared and working on this yourself, a method and a means for retrieving the dog out of the water when it's in the water. So that this is not only for your dog's benefit, it's for your own benefit. But you need to be able to, you start at the stern, and the next time you do it 3 feet forward of the stern and teach him to swim back to the stern, and eventually work your way around to the bow of the boat, and so that he'll come to you at the stern of the boat, or whatever point of the boat it is where you are going to retrieve him. When you're working with cats, and cats need to do this too, you need to use, you can hang a piece of hawser. You can get that from a tugboat captain maybe. All you need is about 6 or 8 or 10 feet of 3 or 4 inch hawser, which is very, very heavy, large rope, the kind of rope they use for towing tugs or for towing barges, that sort of thing. Or some people will hang a piece of carpeting over the side into the water. It needs to go from the deck of the boat or from the rail of the boat down into the water. And what we want to do is have the cat climb up whatever it is. And generally, I always tell people the first time you take your cat down and drop him in the water at the base, you don't want to have somebody standing in front of where he comes aboard, because he might run right up the thing and across over the top of your face when he comes aboard. But the idea is for him to learn to run up that whatever it is that you have hanging in the water that he can get his claws into and work his way aboard. You can hang another one up near the bow if you want, but eventually you need to teach your cat the same thing you're talking about teaching the dog, and that is to board the boat to either know where to board the boat or have the means to board the boat at various locations around the boat. One of the things to keep in mind is that when an animal falls in the water, if it hasn't gone through this very often, its eyes will fixate on whatever it happens to see when it suddenly looks after the trauma of hitting the water. And if the shoreline is a half mile away and that's what he's looking at, he may swim toward the shoreline even though the boat's right behind him. So you want to teach them that the boat is there, and that's the whole purpose of this. You need to train them or leave them home, or the other alternative is to not allow them on deck or make sure they're on deck with you. Again, do not shock older pets, and those that can't pass the test, stay ashore or stay below. Excuse me. And remember that declawed cats and animals that have a tendency to jump in the water should never be on deck when you're not there, when you're not watching closely. If you've got a dog who jumps in the water every chance he gets, then he needs to be on a leash and tethered to some sort of place on deck where he can't get to the side. Or a cat, same thing with a cat. Some cats, I've heard of cats that have developed a fondness for jumping in the water. So you got to watch for that. But declawed cats don't have any way to get back aboard. So if you have a declawed cat, you need to be extra special careful here. Lifeline netting and life jackets. Lifeline netting is not a bad idea if you have cats on board, even cats or dogs for that matter. And most of the time people who have pets do have lifeline netting all the way around the boat. And one of the things I like to point out is that there's a tendency with cats, if the boat is rolling at all, cats have a tendency when they lose their footing to kind of jump and kind of jump in the air to regain their footing. And if at the time that they're jumping in the air the deck rolls out from under them, they could end up in the water. Whereas if there's lifeline netting there, that's not going to happen. The lifeline netting will pull them back aboard. Lifeline netting is not a bad idea. Life jackets are good, especially for dogs. Certain breeds do not swim. Okay, if you have a bulldog, an English bulldog, I would not let them in the water. They tend to, for the most part, sink like a rock. I do not like life jackets on cats. My feeling is that very often cats are good swimmers, and generally, if you teach your cat to swim, hopefully you won't need a life jacket. My concern about life jackets in a cat is that they very often could end up drowning just by fighting the life jacket. If you have a cat and he's comfortable with a life jacket and he wears one, by all means, that's great. My approach to this situation is to teach the animal to deal with the circumstances rather than relying on an artificial means, although any dog that's spending a significant amount of time on deck or that tends to go in the water on his own should always be wearing a life jacket. When you need to evaluate your life jackets, your pet's life jackets, make sure that they are sturdy enough, make sure that you can lift the animal out of the water by the jacket. And I found when we were sailing, we've been back about 8 years now from sailing, but in my experience, not very many people use life jackets on their animals when they're out cruising. I feel it's important that we do something to assure the safety of our pets as much as possible. And the ideas I have suggested here is a good idea here. And again, make a lifting harness if you have a large dog and practice with it so that you're able to get the dog. Doesn't do anybody any good if you have a heart attack trying to pull your 100-pound dog back aboard your boat. So, you need to deal with these situations. And probably the greatest risk for cats that live aboard a boat is when you're tied up alongside a wharf or a dock. Cats have a tendency to want to go ashore. Not that they don't like it aboard the boat. They do great aboard the boat, but they have a tendency to want to explore. When we lived in the marina in Baltimore, we lived there for 3 years at Harborview Marina in Baltimore, where Annie was the dock master and the manager of the marina. One of the issues that they had were at that marina where we had over 100 live-aboard vessels. One of the big issues they had was with cats getting off the boat where they lived and going and exploring somebody else's boat. And we even had one of the transient vessels that came through that was on its way down the ICW to head off to the Bahamas lost their cat while they were at the marina in Baltimore and never saw it again. I'm sure it went ashore and probably ended up someplace on somebody else's boat. It's quite a common scenario. So you need to make sure that when you are tied up alongside somewhere, that your cat is restricted to down below and not allowed on deck without you being there to personally observe it. We had some very good friends that down in the Caribbean who lost their cat while they were stopped in the Berry Islands in the Bahamas. Their cat went ashore, and it's a very small island where they were ashore. But and they stayed there for an extra 7 or 8 days looking for their cat and never did see it again. And I know that what happened was that they were docked at a marina while they were there, and I'm sure that what happened is the cat ended up on somebody else's boat, stowed itself away someplace where it was hidden, and by the time whoever's boat it was on, by the time they realized the cat was on board, they had no idea probably where it came from. So you need to keep in mind that that's probably one of the biggest risks of losing your pet, which is one of the reasons that I stress identification so strongly. The tags and the embroidered collar and all of those things that will allow you to get your pet back if it gets separated. And remember that when you're underway, your pets should be tucked in somewhere. Dogs should be in a carrier. Cats should be tucked into a cat carrier someplace and in some sort of location. The reason they put animals in carriers when they're on an airline is so that if there's turbulence or any kind of issues, the carrier gets slammed around, but the animal inside it is fairly well insulated from that slamming around by virtue of the fact that he's in a confined space. And that's why it's important that your carrier be fit appropriately to the size of the animal. And your dog should not be tied up in the cockpit when you get into heavy seas so that you end up having to make a choice between abandoning the control of the boat or losing your pet. So think about those kinds of things. You should make plans ahead of time for that sort of thing. And here's a couple of ideas. Up at the top here is crittersinflatable.com. This is a type of inflatable life vest for a dog. Have read some pretty good reports on these things. It's important if your dog's going to wear one of these. It's important, number one, that he not be a chewer. Okay, they're expensive. You don't want him to chew it up. It's silly to try and put one of these on a dog who's going to chew at it. You don't want it on a dog if you have a cat with claws that's going to be clawing at it. That's something to keep in mind. But that's a reasonable alternative to a solid type of flotation device. And then down at the bottom we have the Paws Aboard boarding ladder for big dogs. This could be a solution for those of you who have big dogs and don't have any way to get them aboard. It's not a solution if something happens. It's not a solution if something happens to your dog while your dog is in the water and he's unconscious or anything like that. But it is a solution for getting your dog aboard if he likes to swim or go ashore with you, and helps get him back on deck. And so this is a question here of how many pets is too many. In this particular picture, there's a cat and 5 dogs, I believe. And these people went all the way from Puerto Rico down to Venezuela and back with these animals aboard. And it was a 44-foot sailboat, and they felt very comfortable with having that many pets on board. That would be too many for me, but it all depends on your personal choices. Now, behavioral issues to keep in mind. Really, there aren't that many issues. Most of the time, if people have animals with serious behavioral issues, they're probably not going to take them along cruising. But, the questions I've had, these are questions I've had at boat shows when I used to do boat shows. What cruise is better, a dog or a cat? I feel that cats tend to adjust and adapt to life aboard with fewer issues than dogs, but it all depends. If they start out very young, if they start out as a puppy or a kitten, they're going to all do equally well. I don't think it's a big deal. Uh, Most of the time, the adjustment is pretty minor. What kind of dog cruises best? There's as many answers as there are cruisers. There's as many answers as there are breeds of dogs. When we were out, we probably saw more Schipperkes out there than I saw as many Schipperkes while I was out in the couple of years that I was out cruising as I saw in 30 years of veterinary practice. They're not all that common in veterinary practice, but they seem to be quite common among cruisers. They are a Belgian or Dutch, I think Belgian barge dog. The breed was originally, and so people feel that they make good boat dogs, and they are. They're very good watchdogs. They tend, in my experience, the Schipperkes that I saw would only bark when a dinghy was obviously approaching the boat. If a dinghy was just going by, they would stand there and watch like a watchdog should, and watch and make sure that it passed on by. But if it turned and started heading when it got within a few boat lengths of the boat, they would start barking like crazy. Very good dogs. I found them to be very enjoyable. But I think for the most part, other than that particular oddity, I found that the breeds that I see that we ran into out cruising pretty much reflected the popularity of breeds in general, and wasn't much of a difference. You should pay attention to whether your dog barks when you leave. If you're one of those people who leaves your dog home and lets it bark while it's at home and doesn't worry about it because the neighbors are too far away to hear it, that's not the case when you're on a boat. Don't assume that he's going to stop barking when you're gone and out of sight. Um, Barking bothers everybody. It bothers everybody in the anchorage. I always tell people you're not miles from nowhere. You're right in the middle of an anchorage, and sound carries really well over water. So if you have a barking issue, you should work on it before you leave. We had a good friend who had a dog aboard the boat, and whenever he went to town or left the dog aboard the boat and took off, the dog would bark continuously until he was ashore, and at that point he didn't hear him anymore, but we did. His assumption was that the dog quit barking as soon as he got ashore, but unfortunately we didn't have the heart to tell him that the dog barked continuously while he was gone. So remember, appropriate barking is welcome. If the dog barks only when there's strangers approaching, only when there's unusual activity, that sort of thing, that's the kind of barking that you want, and everybody in the anchorage welcomes that. The most common problem brought to me at speaking engagements when I was doing boat shows and all of that was the concern that people have with getting their dog to eliminate on board so that they don't have to take it ashore all the time. And this is a touchy issue. My book, Pets on Board: Adapting Your Pet to Travel by Boat or RV, has some concrete suggestions on how to deal with that. There's also a book called You Can Teach Your Dog to Eliminate on Command by Marjorie Smith. She's an MD. Um, there's there's no good answer to this. If you've got a dog that's old, say 6, 8 years old, you're probably going to have much difficulty retraining your dog as far as his bathroom habits. You've spent his whole life training him not to go in this particular environment, and suddenly he can't understand why suddenly you want him to change the rules. And it's going to be a very difficult and frustrating issue. We had some very good friends who had a Siberian Husky that cruised with them, and they could go 2 days and the dog would still not go to the bathroom, and you shouldn't do that. I've heard from a number of cruisers, well, if you just force him to, if you keep him on board long enough, he's going to go. Well, that isn't necessarily so, and if there's any possible health issues in your dog, this is going to exacerbate them, and you're going to have some serious problems. Our friends with the Husky ended up having to stop cruising after two trips down to the Bahamas, and having to stop every day, twice a day, for the dog to go ashore and go to the bathroom, they just couldn't deal with it anymore. So they decided to hang it up and quit cruising until the dog died. And then they went, when the dog got old and died, they went back to cruising again. So just something to keep in mind that you should be aware of. Toilet training your cat is, teaching it to use the toilet on board is a cute idea, but I don't think it has any place on a cruising boat. All you need is once or twice of the cat suddenly falling in the toilet when there's a boat goes by and there's a sudden rocking while he happens to be standing on the toilet, and the cat may never be normal again. So I do not suggest that trip. All right, so finally, when you're traveling and you're out there cruising, remember that you need to check out each new port as you go along. Find out where veterinary help is before you need it. You need to ask around, inquire, find out where the veterinarians are. Is there a veterinarian on this island? Is there a veterinarian in this city? Is there a veterinarian in this port? If you don't know and you can't find out, get on the radio. You get on the single sideband and ask. Down in the Caribbean, you can call the Caribbean Safety and Security Net. They have a list of veterinarians and physicians throughout the entire Caribbean. You tell them where you're at, they'll tell you where the nearest one is. And most of your nets, probably around the world, the cruising nets are going to be able to provide you similar services. The Cruiseheimers net on the east coast of the United States covers the snowbirds that go up and down from New England to the Bahamas and back every year, twice a year. And it covers all the way down into the northern Caribbean. They'll be able to help you. So, don't be afraid to check around. The Coconut Telegraph, check with your other friends and acquaintances that you run into. Get on the VHF radio when you're in a harbor, first arrive, and inquire as to whether there's a veterinarian around. I found that there were lots of good veterinarians in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, British and U.S., and St. Martin, all the way down. There's a large vet school in Grenada. There's another large vet school in St. Kitts that are available where you can get veterinary care. So in the Caribbean, it's not an issue. When you get in Europe, it's not an issue. Certain areas of the world, it may be an issue. So, know ahead of time, or when you get there, find out. So the things to keep in mind here, use a little common sense and caution. Prepare for the most severe importation requirements that you might encounter. We talked about that in part 2, or part 1, I should say. And, carry adequate supplies, whatever you consider to be adequate supplies for your pet and yourself. And don't worry about what might happen. I had one lady that approached me at a boat show one time after my talk, and she was so worried there were so many things that could go wrong that she said, I'm just not going to go cruising. I'm just not going to go now. There's just too many, you talked about too many things that can go wrong. Well, that's the way life is. Things can go wrong. What we do is we plan ahead of time for them and try to be prepared, and we try to take preventative action so that we know in advance what can happen so that it doesn't happen to us. So don't be spooked by what might happen. Preparation and awareness are the key. Most of you will probably be able to cruise for years without ever having a single significant problem with your pets. So these are pictures of my books. Pets on Board, that's the book about behavioral issues, getting your dog to go to the bathroom on board, getting your animal to be comfortable on board. Where There Is No Pet Doctor is a veterinary manual. It gives you some ideas of things, what something might be, tries to deal with the common and the likely things you're likely to encounter, and tends to not address issues that are rare and unexpected. And then, of course, down in the corner here is a non-medical book, Island Hopping to the Caribbean, which is all about Annie and my trip aboard Fidelis from Miami down through the Bahamas to the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and ultimately to the Leeward Islands. So if you're interested, you can pick these up at my website, CaptainDrDave.com, or if you're so inclined to spend a little more or whatever, go to Amazon.com. But they're available there also. So, and here are the discount codes that you can use for purchasing any of these books. And remember, CaptainDrDave.com. My website is always there. It has information on Bahamas entry requirements, along with the blog concerning lots of different issues. And happy sails, and have yourself a good cruise. Thank you very much.